Soviet Union, any evening, any year between 1960 and 1990. A woman walks out of a state grocery store with empty hands. There was nothing worth buying inside. 4 blocks away, in an apartment kitchen, a different economy is open for business. A suitcase on the table, Polish sausage, Western jeans, a few bottles of real French perfume. Whatever came in on this week's shipment, the Soviets had a word for it: Fartsovka. The traders were Fartsovka. And by the 1980s, this second invisible economy had grown so large that the country that policed everything, where you worked, what you read, who you spoke to, could not shut it down. On paper, the Soviet Union had exactly one economy: planned, state-run, accountable to nobody but itself. Prices were fixed by decree, not by demand. What got produced and how much was decided years in advance by planners in Moscow who could not possibly predict what an ordinary family would genuinely want to buy that winter. The result was a strange, chronic mismatch. Warehouses full of goods nobody wanted and empty shelves for everything people did. Think about that for a second. An entire country's supply of shoes, sugar, and children's shoes could be dictated by a 5-year document with no real mechanism to notice, mid-year, that the plan was wrong. And the state itself quietly never fully believed in the plan either, which is part of what makes the rest of the story make sense. This is the story of the economy that formed in the gap the state's own plan kept leaving open. An underground so large, so essential, and so quietly tolerated that by the end, it wasn't really underground at all. It was simply how the country ran. Here is how the good side of it actually worked. Foreign tourists arrived in Moscow or Leningrad carrying, often without realizing it, the most valuable cargo in the country: ordinary Western consumer goods, jeans, chewing gum, cassette tapes. The moment they stepped outside their hotel, young men would fall in step beside them, asking in careful, rehearsed English whether they had anything to sell. A pair of Levi's bought for around $20 in an American mall could resell in Moscow for somewhere around 200 rubles. More than a month's wages for many Soviet workers. Payment was almost never in rubles. Dollars, Deutschmarks, British pounds, currencies ordinary Soviet citizens were legally forbidden to even hold, were the real prize. Tourists were only the most visible source. Soviet sailors returning from foreign ports smuggled goods home in duffel bags. Diplomats carried luxury items through customs that ordinary citizens could never access. Foreign students, sometimes without fully meaning to, turned their dormitory rooms into informal shops, trading records and clothing to Soviet classmates eager for a taste of somewhere else. Certain locations became known meeting points almost by tradition. The gum department store on Red Square, the Inn Tourist and Metropole hotels, the arrivals hall at Sheremetyevo Airport. Anywhere foreigners concentrated, a small, watchful crowd of Fartsovka was never far behind, relying on networks of taxi drivers and hotel staff to tip them off when a promising group of visitors checked in. The risk was real, even if the demand made it worthwhile. Fartsovka fell under Soviet laws against speculation, and a conviction could mean years in a labor camp. Not a fine, not a warning. Most traders operated on a simple calculation. The odds of getting caught on any single deal were low, and the profit from one good week could outweigh a month's ordinary salary many times over. But goods were only half the underground economy. The other half ran on something you couldn't smuggle in a suitcase: connections. The Russians called it Blat. Blat was the art of getting something done through who you knew rather than what you could pay. Your neighbor's cousin worked at the meat processing plant. You needed sausages nobody could find in any shop. You called in a favor and repaid it later, in some other currency at some other time. No money changed hands, which was precisely the point. Legally, it wasn't a transaction. It was just friends helping friends. A doctor could get you an appointment months early, if you could get his son into a good university. A factory manager could grant your family extra vacation days, if your wife, a hairdresser, styled his daughter's wedding for free. The Soviet Union called itself a classless society. Blat quietly built an entire invisible hierarchy on top of it. One that decided who ate well, who dressed well, and who spent years on a waiting list for something everyone else had somehow already gotten. Soviet sociologists who studied this system after the fact described it as a kind of second currency, one that never showed up in any state ledger, but that every citizen understood instinctively. You kept a mental account of who owed you and who you owed, the same way you track a bank balance. Losing your network of Blat contacts could be just as damaging as losing your salary. With enough hard currency and the right connections, almost anything was reachable through this second economy. A video cassette recorder, a used car passed hand to hand through a shadow network of mechanics and dealers, prescription medicine unavailable in any Soviet pharmacy, and sold at a devastating markup to families with no other option. Fuel siphoned from state trucks, electronics that vanished from a warehouse manifest and reappeared the same week in someone's apartment. Some goods carried a kind of social status all their own, entirely separate from what they actually did. A pair of real Levi's wasn't just warmer or better stitched than the Soviet alternative. It announced silently that you had access, that you knew someone, that you existed slightly outside the reach of the ordinary state store. In a country built on official equality, denim quietly became one of the clearest signals of who actually had more. But the black market wasn't the only parallel economy running underneath Soviet ideology. The state ran one of its own quite openly, under its own roof, and never quite managed to explain the contradiction. Starting in the 1960s, a chain of state-run shops called Beriozka, Little Birch Tree, sold exactly the goods an ordinary Soviet store never had. Imported electronics, quality clothing, even cars, priced not in rubles but in foreign currency or special certificates issued by a state trading agency. A Lada sedan bought this way ran around $7,000, roughly half its usual price for anyone who happened to have that kind of hard currency lying around. A Volga could run $15,000 to $25,000. Getting in the door legally meant having foreign currency, which was itself illegal for an ordinary Soviet citizen to possess. In practice, that meant you needed to have worked abroad, or have relatives sending money home from outside the country, or for most people, none of the above, which left the black market as the only real way in. One underground Soviet writer summed up the contradiction bluntly in 1978. Beriozka stores, he wrote, destroy people's faith in a classless society. He wasn't wrong. A state that could sentence its own citizens to a labor camp for trading in dollars was, at the very same time, running an entire retail chain that only accepted them. Here's what actually let this economy survive for 4 decades. It had no headquarters, no single supply chain, and almost no fixed prices, which meant there was no one warehouse to raid and shut the whole thing down. A transaction could happen in a hotel lobby, a train station corridor, or a kitchen, and be finished, cash and goods both gone, in under a minute. And no, this is not something anyone made up for effect. Even the people paid to stop it were often, quietly, part of it. Militia officers assigned to patrol for Fartsovka near tourist hotels sometimes became their best customers, or looked the other way in exchange for a small cut. The system meant to police the black market was, in places, absorbed by it. Even the Beriozka stores leaked into the same informal economy they were meant to keep separate. Certificates meant to be spent by the original recipient were routinely resold at a markup to Soviet citizens desperate enough to want in, turning a store designed to isolate hard currency from ordinary people into just one more good traded quietly on the same underground exchange as everything else. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, because the state's response to all this was not always a shrug. In 1961, Soviet authorities arrested a currency trader named Jan Rokotov and his associate Vladislav Faibishenko, running a foreign currency operation worth millions of rubles. Under the law in force at the time of their arrest, the maximum sentence was 8 years. They were originally sentenced to 15. That still wasn't enough for Nikita Khrushchev, who reportedly saw the confiscated pile of gold coins and foreign banknotes and demanded they be shot. So the Presidium passed a new law introducing the death penalty for large-scale currency speculation and applied it retroactively to a crime committed before the law existed, which was itself illegal under the Soviet Union's own legal code. Rokotov and Faibishenko were executed by firing squad in July 1961. The message was unmistakable, and it still didn't work. For every trader removed from the streets, new ones appeared, because the underlying shortage that created the demand never went away. The state could execute individual Fartsovka. It could not execute the gap between what people needed and what its own stores actually had. In the years after the execution, the trade didn't disappear so much as go quiet and change shape. Fewer traders dealt openly in currency itself, since that carried the harshest penalty on the books. More of them shifted toward goods, clothing, records, cosmetics, where the legal risk, while still serious, fell well short of a firing squad. The irony sharpened over time, too. The very state that shot 2 men for trading currency was, within a decade, quietly expanding its own network of currency-only stores because it needed the hard cash just as badly as any street trader did. It simply preferred to keep that particular hunger inside its own accounting books. If you're finding this as fascinating as I am, hit subscribe. There's a lot more behind this curtain. And yet, when the state that had spent decades hunting this economy finally collapsed, the underground didn't vanish with it. It simply stepped into daylight. What nobody quite expected was how directly the skills built in the shadow economy would translate into the free-for-all of 1990s privatization. State assets, oil fields, factories, entire industries were sold off at astonishing speed, often to whoever already understood how to move money, goods, and favors around a system that officially pretended none of that happened. Many of the entrepreneurs who built fortunes in that decade, including some who became genuinely globally famous businessmen, had spent their teens and 20s learning exactly this: how to price something the state refused to price, how to move it without being seen, and who to trust when the official rules offered no protection at all. When the rules disappeared completely in 1991, that specific education turned out to be worth more than any factory. It's worth sitting with how strange that transition really was. The exact behavior that could have gotten a person a labor camp sentence under Brezhnev, buying low, selling high, moving goods around a broken distribution system, became almost overnight simply called business. The law changed. The skill set didn't have to. The Beriozka stores themselves didn't survive the transition. Once ordinary rubles could legally buy foreign goods on the open market, a chain built entirely around the scarcity of legal hard currency lost its entire reason to exist almost overnight, and quietly closed for good around 1991 and 1992. One small, forgotten casualty of the exact same collapse that made the black market's old skills suddenly legitimate. Today, estimates of just how large the Soviet shadow economy truly was still vary widely among economists, from roughly a tenth to as much as a quarter of the entire economy by the final Soviet decade, depending on exactly what's being counted. Nobody could ever measure it precisely because precision was never the point of an economy built to stay invisible, and it didn't disappear with communism. Modern Russia is still estimated to carry one of the larger informal economies among major nations, and Blat, favors, connections, who you know, never stop mattering nearly as much as any official rulebook. Even the physical memory of the old system lingers in odd corners. Original Beriozka signage occasionally turns up at flea markets and antique stalls today, sold without any apparent irony to collectors nostalgic for an institution that once excluded almost everyone who might now want to own a piece of it. There's a real paradox sitting at the center of this story. The Soviet Union was among the most tightly controlled societies of the 20th century. It tracked where you lived, where you worked, what you were allowed to read. And underneath every layer of that control, an entire second society kept running anyway, built and maintained by millions of people who were not criminals or dissidents in any meaningful sense. They were simply trying to live an ordinary life inside a system that had quietly promised more than it could ever deliver. That gap between what a system promises and what it actually provides can open up anywhere, under any government. And when it does, some version of this economy is always waiting to fill it. Even the government itself, it turns out, is rarely immune to needing a backdoor of its own. There's an old Soviet joke. A man walks into a shop and asks if they have any meat. The clerk tells him, "No, this is the shop with no fish. The shop with no meat is across the street." It was funny because it was true, but the real punchline was never spoken out loud. 4 blocks away, in an apartment kitchen, a woman was selling Polish sausage out of a suitcase. She always had meat. You just had to know which door to knock on. The stores went empty for 70 years. The kitchens never did, not once, not even close. If this story gave you a piece of Cold War history you'd never quite heard before, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. And the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next one is to hit subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds, it costs nothing, and there's another story from behind the Iron Curtain already on its way.